This is a brief audio review of Chapter 3 for Social Problems in Contemporary Society at Mount San Antonio College. Chapter 3, Racial and Ethnic Inequality. Okay, so first, to understand race and ethnicity from a sociological perspective, we have to talk about how race is socially constructed. So what does it mean for something to be socially constructed? It just means that the meanings behind something in the culture have to do with the societal and historical and the value systems and norms, and all of these kind of patterns together create the meaning that we attach to people in society, and it's specifically within race and ethnicity that we attach to groups of people in society. So race is socially constructed, and we can see this because definitions of racial categories change when you look at them in different cultural contexts. And of course, another way to see if something is socially constructed is to see if it's changed over time, right? Because if something is just, inherent to society or to life, then you would see it exist the same way throughout all the cultures in the world, and you would see it exist throughout time the same. And since race does not do this, race is something we made up to categorize groups of people. So race is just a socially constructed category of people that share some biologically transmitted traits that members of a particular society define as important. So oftentimes the way we racialize people in American society is phenotypically, right? Based on skin color, based on hair texture, things of this nature. So when was race invented? Well, centuries ago, as global trade brought the world's people into greater contact, awareness of human diversity increased. So by the late 1500s, Europeans started using the word race to categorize people. So this is a very nice way of saying colonialism gave us race, right? And colonialism, specifically as Europeans established their supposed dominance over other groups of people around the world, largely to extract their resources for Europe's gain, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit later anyway, but really at this point, all you need to know is that we created these things as social categories to define people, and that we continue to do that throughout time, right? So we still engage with some of these stereotypes from the past, and we continue to evolve and create more stereotypes into the present. So are races real? Well, at best, racial categories are misleading, and at worst, they're a very harmful way to divide society. So there's no biological sense of race, right? So for example, if you've ever given blood, right, do they just give you blood from someone of the same race or ethnicity? No, right? It's based on blood type, and there might be similarities of blood type based on biological markers, but you can't say, every, let's say, white person has this blood type, right? And every Latinx person has this blood type, or every Asian person has this blood type. It doesn't work that way, right? We know that there's much more genetic diversity within racial categories than between them, meaning there's more variations within the biological makeup of a category like white than there is between the difference between white and black, right? So we have to be cognizant of the fact that we think these things are biological, but again, they are social, and we give them biological meanings, and we give them biological justifications for creating these kind of unequal social categories. So, again, some people ask, should races exist at all as a social category, right? Some sociologists argue that if you divide humanity into racial categories, this is simply a strategy to allow some people to dominate others, right? And as time goes by, members of our society have increasing difficulty seeing each other in terms of rigid racial categories, especially when it comes to multiracial people, right? We know that there were laws that restricted interracial marriage up into about a generation and a half ago. So we're talking about, in some places, till the late 60s, early 70s, where you could not marry someone and produce children that were mixed race. So of course, when we look at multiracial people today, there are more interracial marriages, there are more, interracial couples that have children, but at the same time, it's largely because there was a point at which There were still interracial couples, but they were legally restricted from marrying. They were legally restricted. There were punishments, for having children socially. So why? Right? Why would it matter? Why would it matter if people of two different racial categories have children together? Because if race is socially constructed, right? If it's a category we make up, right? We basically say all the people of the entire world fit into like 4 or 5 categories, which is completely not just a crazy oversimplification, but insane, right? It's insane to say, nope, everyone fits into these little categories. Because it's easier for us to stereotype and make assumptions when we put people in those large pan-ethnic categories, right? But once you start being multiracial, it breaks down these ability to stereotype people based on looking at them. So one example, I have a friend of mine that his mother's Japanese, his father is Russian. And people are always like, what are you? Right? They have such a hard time placing him because, they don't understand, that multiracial realities exist, which of course they always have, but it's been much more, punishment in the past. So, but people still feel the need to try to fit people into these pan-ethnic categories, right? Why? So that they can figure out how they're supposed to treat you. Because race is a large marker, and race and ethnicity are a large marker of bodies and their worth in society, right? So we'll talk about colorism and things of that nature later as well, but it makes sense then that people, if we make snap judgments about people based on their outward appearance of race, then we want to place people in these categories so we can make assumptions about them. But when people are multiracial, it really kind of, boggles the brain of a lot of bigots because they want to put someone in one of those categories, and that just doesn't work, right? So it does show these things are socially constructed. The whole reason there were laws against mixing and against marriage and against, having children together was so we could maintain these fake social categories of race, right? Because again, race, the way that we look at it is based on the phenotype presented. But we know, like for example, let's say looking specifically at like one particular Black family, we know that within that family, skin tone can range from light skin to dark skin. So this whole idea of looking at race as a skin tone, as hair texture, as certain phenotypic, expressions is kind of, it's very limiting and dumb, but really because even within families, there's a lot of variation, right? So a lot of this, we just judge people based on these outward appearances and then determine whether or not we give them value in the culture. So ethnicity is similar to race. Ethnicity is a shared cultural heritage, which typically involves common ancestors, language, and religion. So it's a little bit different than race. Race, we like to put, especially in American society, we have a very white-black race dynamic, right? And that's often the way that we've understood race throughout the years. But of course, there's many other racial categories and ethnicities that all live and experience, unique subjugation within American society. So we're going to talk a little bit about how, because of immigration, because of, slavery, because of these other factors, there is kind of a heterogeneity of people in American society, but the social value of the categories have everything to do with the kind of white supremacy of the past and really of the present. Okay, so when talking about race and ethnicity, we have to talk about, a minority and how this works. So basically, a minority is just a category of people identified by physical or cultural traits that society subjects to disadvantages. So minorities are visible, right? They share a distinctive identity, which can be based on race, like physical traits, which are difficult to change, or ethnicity, including your dress, your accent, or, your language, which, people can change a little bit easier. So when it comes to white privilege refers to the fact that white people, relative to those in minority categories, enjoy social advantages, right? So minorities, in contrast, have social disadvantages. Minorities typically have less schooling, hold lower paying jobs, and experience higher rates of poverty. Right? About 38% of the US population falls into a racial or ethnic minority category, and this share is increasing. minorities have already become a majority in 63 of the country's 100 largest cities, right? And 4 states, such as California, that we're living in. So, we know that this idea also of being a minority is supposed to be being less, right? But it really just means being socially less. Just in the way when we discuss gender in chapter 4, we'll discuss how there are more women biologically assigned at birth women than biologically assigned at birth men, but women are still considered a minority. It's not because there's less of them, it's because they have less social power. So in the same way, like some states, some counties, some areas might have larger populations of, marginalized categories of people, but they still are considered minorities because of the social kind of opportunities that they lack, if that makes sense, right? So white privilege is basically, not having to deal with the extra hassles and the extra stigmas of being a minority in American society. So there's this great article by Peggy McIntosh from 1988 called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And if I had more time, I'd explain all of that to you right now. But basically, I highly suggest you read this article. You should have to read it at some point if you continue on in a sociology, course path. But basically, what the article talks about, as she's a white woman, and she starts reflecting on her white privilege, and this idea that she carries around an invisible backpack with her at all times of all of these things that protect her so that she doesn't have to deal with the same stigmas and problems that, minorities would have to. So for example, she talks about how, being white means not being followed by security or not being assumed to be stealing. That if you swear or wear, raggedy clothes, you're not somehow representative of your entire race, right? Or the one that stands out to me the most, she made a lot of these assertions in her article. The one that stands out to me the most is that when she picks a bandage, right, for a cut, it does almost match her skin tone. Right, I'm sure you've seen this with Band-Aids, that kind of like weird quote-unquote skin tone color that's just like, it's almost like Simpsons yellow or, this kind of like weird orange color. But you can imagine how marginalizing that is for a lot of communities that, when something is called flesh tone, when something is called, skin color, and that's only one representative skin tone of many shades of people's experience, like that really does prioritize or say that this is the one that's the color, not these other ones. So just this kind of internalization that can happen from childhood to basically tell people that they are not the norm, that they are not the majority, right? So, and again, with white privilege, she talks about, not having to really worry in the same way, not having the same stigmas apply to you, right? You're seen as an individual instead of seen as representing your whole racial category, right? As a white person, you're not asked to speak on behalf of all white people, as you often are if you're a tokenized minority, especially in like the workplace. They'll say, oh, well, you're the one person of this particular race or ethnicity, so what do they think about it? As if you're like the spokesman for your own race or ethnicity, which is insane. But that's how privilege works, is that white people get to be individuals, while people of color have to be representatives of their own race. So anything they do deviant, right, whether it's commit a crime or just, any general deviance, is considered more deviant, more threatening. And of course, when white people do the exact same things, it's considered like, well, people are letting off steam, boys will be boys, that kind of stuff. And it's very, very pervasive in the way that people think, the way that the criminal justice system ends up working. All sorts of consequences come from this invisible knapsack. So Peggy's whole point in her article is that we need to unpack this invisible knapsack. We need to see how white privilege operates and gives people structural and social advantages. Because think about it this way, even if it's not like a red carpet being rolled out for you, it's not 20 barriers being placed in your way, right? And so that's kind of really what privilege means, is the absence of suspicion, of stigma, of stereotypes, of barriers in your way to success. Okay, so obviously immigration has a lot to do with, racial and ethnic composition of American society. So the book goes a little bit into some of the kind of historical stuff, so we'll touch on it a little bit, right? So obviously everyone living in North America, except for indigenous populations, all were people who lived somewhere else. They all came here at some point, whether it was through, colonization, whether it was through immigration, whether it was through slavery, right? People were either elected to come or brought to these shores, except for obviously the indigenous populations that were colonized and massacred. So the great immigration that they refer to in the book, right, is basically this interesting time period where in the very turn of the century, 1900, 80% of the people that were living in New York either had been born abroad or their parents had. So much of the composition of American society was coming from immigration, these influxes of people. So nativists were people who opposed high levels of immigration, fearing it would endanger the country's culture, right? Doesn't that sound kind of familiar? These same people exist generation through generation. And again, it's because immigrants are an easy scapegoat. They have very little power, they have very little resources, so it's easy to point at them and blame them instead of like the structures of capitalism and globalization and colonization that are actually the reason for problems. But anyway, so immigrants are an easy target, and they have been for generations, right? But we'll talk about this a little bit. Or I guess I could just touch on it now. It's interesting how, though, the immigrants themselves, if they came from European countries, even if they were denigrated at some point, they were able to kind of make their way into the norm of whiteness in the culture in a way that ethnic minorities that are coming in from other countries are not going to be able to do that, right? So, you have your Greek people, your Italians, your Irish, especially the Irish, were considered literally subhuman, right? They were came to this country in such desperation and poverty. So they were an easy target. But again, through a couple generations of intermarriage, boom, they're considered white, right? Of course, they weren't when they came here. They were, again, like I said, they were literally considered subhuman and they were subjected to all sorts of treatment. But the difference is for these kind of white European folks, even if they were Eastern European, because they had it a little bit worse, they were able to kind of like assimilate into the dominant culture because of their skin tone, right? So we'll talk later about how that affects the way that we understand immigrants today, because people will say, oh, well, my Italian ancestor, this or that, which is actually, of course, it could be true, right? I mean, my grandmother was, her mom came here with her when she was a small child, and she was subjected to a lot of those kind of slurs that we don't use anymore against Italians. But that's definitely not my experience as her granddaughter, right? Or the fact that my dad is an immigrant, but because he's white, it's not stigmatizing, right? I'm first gen on his side, but that doesn't, I've never faced marginalization as a result because I'm white, right? So we'll talk about how it's ethnicity, but it's also race, right? When it comes to the way that we understand and define immigrants and their worth. Oftentimes we love immigrants when they can come here and we can exploit them for cheap labor, but we hate immigrants when they quote unquote overstay their welcome, as we'll talk about with the Chinese Exclusion Act and things like this. Okay, so going back to the nativists and the quota system, during the 1920s, Congress enacted laws, including the Immigration Act of 1924, which cut immigration and created a quota system that limited the number of people entering the U.S. from various countries around the world. And so again, to not oversimplify, but it basically prioritized European white folks coming here as immigrants, not people coming from Latin America or Asia or Africa or other places. So the quota system basically put a limit on how many people could come from, let's say, South Asia or something like that. And the end of the quota system didn't happen until 1965. First, it was a presidential order, but then Congress ended up ending it as well. So this led to a wave of mass immigration in the mid-60s, right? So most of those immigrants that were coming in the 60s were from Mexico or other nations in Latin America, also the Philippines, South Korea, and other Asian countries. And this became controversial, though if you look at the specific countries we're discussing, a lot of those were, like the Philippines, colonial territories of the United States that faced upheaval and problems largely because of those colonial conquests. So, it's interesting, the relationship between those things, right? Like, U.S. imperialism creates problems all over the world, which then creates refugees, which then the U.S. says, well, we don't want those refugees, right? So we'll talk about that as we go on in the class. So when it comes to the current immigration controversy, obviously in the Trump era, immigration was a major issue across the United States, and the focus being on undocumented immigrants. And again, undocumented immigrants are such an easy scapegoat, right? Trump got a lot of popularity and support by getting people to chant "build the wall," right? The idea being that if you just build a wall, that's going to somehow end the immigration problem. But the fun part about just reality is that planes fly over walls, right? And a lot of people who are undocumented are not people who are crossing a border. These are people who came here on a work-related visa or a school-related visa and then just never went home, right? That's a lot of the people that are undocumented in this country. Yes, people do cross the border, but also building a multi-billion-dollar wall, which causes all sorts of ecological problems and whatever, also can, as I can't remember exactly which group showed this recently, but you can get a $5 ladder and just get right over that wall. So anyway, those are not long-term strategies to deal with immigration. Some argue that we shouldn't have borders at all. So it's really an interesting time period to kind of pivot and see where, in the next 20 years, where our understanding of immigration will go, right? We have dreamers, we have a lot of people that they came here as children, so they've gotten certain protections under DACA that were reverted in Trump era and then kind of somewhat given back, but obviously the trust is not there in the same way. So there is large movements going on to create more status and rights for people who are undocumented right now in the United States. Okay, so let's talk about some of the patterns of majority-minority interaction. They're not good, right? So first you have genocide. This is the systematic killing of one category of people by another. So we've seen many examples of this. I mean, most of the time we think about, the Holocaust, but there's various cultures throughout time, right? And really, when we look at the kind of patterns of history as to, colonialism, so much genocide was involved in that. Like even in American history, we see genocide of the indigenous populations, right? A planned, strategized genocide. So, I'm sure you've all had that false education about the first Thanksgiving and everyone broke bread together and they sat down and everyone was happy, the Pilgrims and the Indians. But what they leave out of that analysis is the smallpox blankets, right? The idea that indigenous populations were not previously exposed to European illnesses. When they came over here on boats, they brought their diseases with them. And they gave them willingly, knowingly to these indigenous populations. And because they had no natural immunity, kind of similar to the COVID thing, right? It being a novel virus, it wiped out so many people's immune systems. That was a large part of it. And then people that did not die in those situations were forcibly relocated, were killed on the spot, were marched through the Trail of Tears. So even American history is large, periods of these kind of things, but we don't like to talk about it, right? We like to point to another country and be like, hey, look at Germany, look what they did, right? And not really examine what did we do and what are the parallels there. I mean, horrible history lesson about the Holocaust. So this is a thing, I just find this interesting. A lot of people will say that thing of like, oh, if I could go back in time, I'd kill baby Hitler, blah, blah, blah. Which I don't know why it's always got to be baby Hitler. Maybe not like teenage Hitler. But anyway, the real key to me is that killing Hitler wouldn't necessarily change that history. And here's why. eugenics was the basis of the ideology that Hitler used to justify extermination of all of those people. So eugenics was an accepted science, quote unquote. I can't even say without quote unquote. It was accepted as science, and basically the way that it worked was, it was this idea that, you know, some people had good genes and other people had inferior genes. And of course, the people who created it said, well, we're superior, so we're good, right? And of course, that's not how science works. But anyway, eugenics is BS. It doesn't met out in actual biological terms. But it was a social understanding of science that said that some people were superior to others that was popular around all the Western nations in the world. So the fact that Germany took it and ran with it is not that surprising. There's a precedent to the Holocaust called the California experiment. So this is a situation in California where thousands of people were forcibly sterilized without their consent. And sterilized just meaning they were rendered incapable of having children. And so this is part of what eugenics was about, was prevent people from having kids that you considered undesirable. So this was done based on IQ tests, done, you know, obviously targeted against communities of color. I mean, there's even lawsuits in California going back to the 2010s of women being sterilized while right after they gave birth in prison, right? Like they would sign paperwork to give birth in prison, and part of that paperwork would say, okay, yeah, no, they consent to having their ovaries removed, which is not true. And so, you know, while someone's doped up on meds, you make them sign this thing, and then they wake up unable to have future children, right? And this is a ongoing lawsuit that's been going on for a minute now. So we know that these sterilization practices continued, right, for many years in many ways. But the California experiment itself was, you know, basically targeting certain communities like the feeble-minded, quote unquote, and these groups that were considered inferior. And when Hitler first started his campaign and started rounding up people that were disabled and rounding up people that were homosexuals and killing all of them, the people that started the California experiment literally were quoted as saying, he's beating us at our own game. So I just want to point that out there, that, you know, American history is rife with this stuff, but often we don't examine it because these are rocks that no one wants to pick up and see all the stuff underneath, right? But we have to, as sociologists, if we want to understand society, we have to take a cold look at the reality of the past so that we can see those parallels in the current day and avoid the same horrible circumstances, right? So again, another pattern of majority-minority interaction is segregation. So segregation is the physical and social separation of categories of people. So we'll also talk later a little bit about hypersegregation, the intense segregation that's been found in many inner city areas. And of course, this is the result of redlining and policies that made it so that, you know, people would be stuck within those communities. And we'll talk about globalization and how all the jobs left, but all the people stayed, right? But, you know, segregation is something we know a lot about because of, you know, Rosa Parks, or, you know, the kind of Jim Crow segregation that was legalized within American society. And so what's interesting about Rosa Parks is it wasn't by accident that she decided to sit down on that bus. That was like a planned strategy. We often hear about it contextualized as she was tired, she was coming home from work, she just didn't want to get up, right? But in reality, Claudette Colvin, she actually did this first. She was a teenager, but because her father was a drunk, because she was pregnant as a teenager, she wasn't considered like moralistic enough to be lifted up as an example for the civil rights movement. So instead, Rosa Parks took this upon herself to be that person because she was above reproach. She was, you know, adored at her job. Within her religious community, there were like no skeletons in her closet, right? She worked for all of these kind of social justice movements before that day on the bus. But we don't hear that much about her history in that way. We just hear about that one moment, that one day that sparked the Montgomery bus boycotts, that then kind of almost like a snowball going down the hill grew with momentum into larger strikes and protests and really the changing of and ending of Jim Crow segregation. So it's just kind of an interesting fact that a lot of that stuff is a bit more nuanced than the kind of stories we're told, especially through our history books that are written in Texas. We often don't get the full picture of these things, right? So anyway, I don't have all the time in the world, so I'll just keep going. So assimilation is the process by which minorities gradually adopt the cultural patterns of the dominant majority population. So this could be, speaking the language or, different religious customs, things of this nature. While pluralism is a state in which people of all racial and ethnic categories have the same social standing. So in a pluralistic environment, assimilation is not necessary, right? Because we would accept and accommodate for people's language differences, for their, religious differences, for even, things as nuanced as, I'm sure when you go to the grocery store, depending on the kind of grocery store you shop in, what kind of ethnic food is available, right? Now, if you shop at a specific store that has these things available, it's different, right? Versus like if you go to a kind of white neighborhoods, I don't know, like an Albertsons or a Ralph's, you're going to have like the Asian food aisle, or, the Latinx food aisle, which is kind of there, versus if you go to, like, for me, I'm a nerd, so I end up shopping at, like, a lot of different places to get my groceries. Like, I get a couple different things from each place. So, like, if there's some specific stuff, I don't buy it from the overpriced Asian food aisle. I'll just go to 99 Ranch Market and get it there, where it's, like, the actual price it would be, not a markup. So it's interesting, like in these white neighborhoods too, there's often, if there is any ethnic food available, it's often charged much more expensive than it would be if you were going to like, the little neighborhood market or, like the actual ethnic food markets. So it's interesting. That's just like an aside, but, we don't account for diversity in so many ways in our culture. We don't have the pluralism that we should have. Instead, a lot of people feel forced to assimilate to kind of, gain that social acceptance in society. Okay, so when it comes to the social standing of U.S. minorities, obviously the indigenous folks, Native Americans, were descendants from the first people to come to North America across the Bering Strait from Asia. And by 1500, the arrival of European colonizers began centuries of conflict, right? Europeans called it bringing civilization, but really what it was destroying ancient and thriving civilizations and replacing them with extractive economies that took the resources from this world and exported them to Europe, hence why Europe was so wealthy. So in 1871, the United States declared that indigenous folks basically made them wards of the federal government. So the goal was assimilation, but it was basically, you can't even really call that assimilation. It's like cultural annihilation is basically what this is, right? So because people were they were basically forced to relocate, they were given inadequate conditions in which to live, face much higher rates of poverty. The education systems are just not as available and robust, right? Especially in the reservation system. So, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about these schools, right? That a lot of indigenous folks were taken to. Up until the 1970s, some of these schools were running that would basically, there's not a nicer way to say it, basically kidnap children from their parents, forcibly separate them from their parents, force them into these residential schools. And now, especially in the US and Canada, there's been a lot of these things happening, kind of bringing light to this system that went on for so long, because they're finding mass graves for the children that died at these schools. And there was no accountability. A lot of these schools were run by, like some were run by the Catholic Church, and even the Catholic Church is like, they don't want to take accountability for that, right? So there's there's so much of this history that hasn't been unpacked and isn't known, and completely impacts the fact that Indigenous folks remain severely disadvantaged with a profound sense of historical injustice because they suffered so much at the hands of these white colonizers who took their land, who destroyed their languages, their cultures, and forced them to adopt white Western principles, and then stole their children from them and forced them to go to these residential schools so they wouldn't learn their Indigenous language, so they wouldn't learn those, Indigenous religious customs and things like that, to force them to assimilate, right? And so nowadays there's a lot of people that they still don't know those Indigenous languages, or some languages are being lost, right, because of the efforts by the federal government. Okay, moving on, or otherwise I'll do this all day. So African Americans are people who have African ancestry, right? So we love to do this hyphenating identity thing. Even though we could just say people are Americans, we kind of rarely refer to people as white Americans in the same way, right? We just call them Americans. They're the default category, or what we call hegemony. But when someone is raced, or, kind of has an ethnic category attached to them, we're distinguishing this idea of you're African and you're American. Though I did see this really interesting, thing where Trevor Noah was talking about this, that it can be a positive thing to be able to still hold on, especially if you're an immigrant, to your cultural roots while also having Americanness, right? So there is something to that to be said as well. But anyway, so obviously a lot of people who are here now were the direct ancestors of people who were enslaved and forcibly stolen and brought to these shores to work in bondage. So slaves had no legal rights or the opportunity to attend school. Obviously, owners would routinely separate families, oftentimes just to punish folks. So they would trade men, women, children for profit. So when slavery finally ended, it didn't end racism, right? Especially according to, I kind of already gave you that little snapshot the other day, but Michelle Alexander, these kind of caste systems happen at different time periods that define what it means to be an African American. So when slavery ended, states started enacting these things called the Black Codes and these other, restrictive laws that would just be weird stuff like you can't be in the town after sundown, but that's the only place you're allowed to work, right? And think about it this way. Under slavery, there was no real need for segregation because there was this idea of people were literally serving other people in their own homes, right? So once there's emancipation takes place, and there's this kind of brief moment of reconstruction where people start to get more rights and the white supremacists freak out. They actually form, things like the KKK, and they bomb a bunch of government buildings that were supporting recently freed slaves, like the Freedmen's Bureau, that would give food and oil and, lamp oil. That's the time period it was. Stuff like that to recently freed slaves. So a lot of those protections and help dried up after the terrorist bombings of the KKK. And so the Black Codes kind of shifted into what's called the Jim Crow laws, right? Which barred people of color from voting, from sitting on juries. It had segregated accommodations for everything, like trains, restaurants, hotels, bathrooms, every public place. And so it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibited segregation in employment and public accommodations that these things started to change. And even with voting, even though voting was part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had to be passed specifically to ban voting requirements that prevented African Americans from having a political voice. And so this is, something, if you've seen the film Selma, they get into why it was important to have specifically the Voting Rights Act as well. And, something we'll talk about later, one of the major provisions of the Voting Rights Act was struck down in recent years. And this provision says that if a state historically discriminated against people of color, then before they can change their voting law, they have to go through a review process. So a place like Texas, right? We have a long history of racism. So if they want to change a voting law, they'd have to go through a review process. They don't have to do that anymore because the Supreme Court struck that down a couple of years ago. A bunch of white people and the Supreme Court struck that down a couple of years ago, said, it's no longer a problem. And what's happened since? Over 20 plus states have now enacted extreme voter suppression laws because that do target minority participation within elections, because they don't have the oversight of, I think it was Article 4, oh, don't quote me on that, of the Voting Rights Act that was overturned a couple of years back. Whatever, you could Google it. Okay, so when we get to 1968, we also get the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which added outlawing discrimination in housing. So a lot of the legal forms of discrimination were then outlawed, but again, it doesn't mean that then automatically everything was great, right? There's still so much consequence of the unequal distribution of resources in past generations. So there's some research that suggests it could take about 5 to 6 generations for inequality to kind of met itself out. So if you talk about something so extreme of inequality, of literally holding people in chains, that it's going to take way more generations for that equity, right? Especially when there was so many laws that made it okay to legally restrict people from having success. And you have things like, obviously, the Tulsa Massacre, or things where when Black communities were successful, when they did have their own middle class, when they were able to thrive, they were often, bombed, murdered, lynched, killed in huge lynch mobs. They would just burn those cities to the ground. So a lot of the stories of African American success, in spite of so much being held back from them, like these amazing American stories of success, we don't hear about, right? And we don't hear about why did those success stories end? Because white mobs killed everybody, destroyed everything, things like that. Then we're doomed to repeat those histories, right, when we don't know what happened in the past. So African Americans still struggle for full participation in U.S. society. The struggle's not over, right? We know this, especially with the more recent movement for Black lives. We know that, being killed, being unarmed and being murdered by police is a daily concern for many people. And that the system itself of policing leads to a lot of these problems, as we'll discuss later. So, African Americans are still disadvantaged. Their wealth is a fraction of that of white families. Like, all of these things that historically happened still have a bearing on today and those resources today. And we'll talk more about the structural parts of that, like the neighborhood segregation, right? And the why can't my brain, redlining, right? These policies of basically drawing a line around minority neighborhoods and saying no loans will be given within these areas. It's a way in which the government put their thumb on the scale to make sure African Americans would not succeed, right? Even when we had programs in the New Deal that were supposed to bring everybody up to the middle class, right? That was legally restricted for people of color. When it comes to Asian Americans, obviously a lot of the history of Asian Americans in American society kind of connects to the West Coast, right? Of being used in the gold rush and building the railroads and a lot of the labor out west. So as soon as the economy slowed, right? This is how this works with any immigrant group. We're like, hey, yay, get over here, do some work. And then as soon as the work slows down, we're like, get the hell out of here, right? So as the economy slowed, whites began to view Asian immigrants as an economic threat, which they called the yellow peril. So during, this time period, you have like restrictive laws that go on in California to try and target Asian populations. So first you have like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically said that men could not bring over their wives or families if they were working here as laborers because they didn't want the population growth of a minority population in California. Same deal as some of those other prosperous communities in the South that were Black communities. Communities that were Asian dominant were targeted, were often, again, assaulted. And again, once we get to World War II and we have the bombing of Pearl Harbor, then this fear of Japan's industrial military might leads to FDR issuing an executive order forcibly relocating people of Japanese ancestry to military camps in remote areas. There's this great graphic novel about this experience by George Takei, who played Sulu on the original Star Trek. And it's called They Called Us Enemy. And it's this really powerful work about the experiences of the daily life for a kid growing up within an internment camp. And what's interesting when Takei has been interviewed by people about his experiences in the internment camps, which he was a strong voice against the forced separation of families at the border and putting children into cages, which happened in recent years, because he saw the parallels between those forced separations and the experiences that his family went through. Though he said he was lucky to have his family with him, his parents were really good at hiding how hard and awful the situation was from the kids as much as they could. But obviously living in a fenced-in military compound is not a normal experience for most children. So what happened was you had all of these people that, just because they had Japanese ancestry, were rounded up. Like, they weren't Japanese nationals. Many were American citizens with the same rights as any other citizen, yet they were rounded up. They took their houses, they took their property, they took all the things they'd worked hard for, their businesses, and just kept them and forcibly relocated people so they'd have like the clothes on their back and a bag of their stuff, and that's all they could leave with. And that is something that's very difficult to come back from, right? People were let out of these camps, but that doesn't mean like, okay, now you're done, the end. And it's interesting how there has been some apology for these things, but not for other kind of, really devastating cultural suppressions or oppressions of people. But, this kind of targeting and suspicion, this idea of where does your loyalty lie, right, is really tied up in that war in World War II. So anyway, when you fast forward to today, all categories of Asian Americans have above average income and education, but this is also misleading, right? Because poverty rates are also very close to or even above the national average for some Asian Americans. So we have this model minority stereotype that says Asian Americans are successful, they work hard, blah, blah, blah. But what this does is it often ignores all the ways in which certain Asian immigrants really suffer. Yes, some immigrants are wealthier. Some have, some immigrants are coming here with education, with money, with resources. Yet there are many other, because again, the category of Asian is wild when you think about it, because you're talking about the largest landmass and trying to say everyone there's the same, right? Like, you're Russian, you're the same as someone who's Indian. And it's same as someone who's, Chinese, same as someone who's from Thailand. It's like, that's so many different cultures, so many different groups of people, so many different languages and religions and unique circumstances and values and cultures that we just squish it into one big category. Why? So we can define people and stereotype them. So there are, many Asian Americans right now that, are working low-paying jobs, multiple jobs, and are still very much struggling to get by, but this model minority myth makes it sound like, nope, they're fine. When it comes to Latinx populations, these are people typically with cultural roots in the nations of Central and South America and the Caribbean and Spain. So there's a lot of Latino cultures, right? In 2016, the official Latinx population in the U.S. stood at 55 million people. About 46% of Latinx families now earn at least 50% or $50,000 annually. But a lot of challenges remain, right? The fact that if a student's first language is Spanish, schools are not great at dealing with that or teaching that. Obviously, California is a little bit better, but there are some achievement gaps there for, kind of the English language learners that have to deal with the extra burden of learning the language as well as learning the content of the material, right? And of course, we know that something we don't really talk about that much is that when there were segregated schools for African Americans, there was also segregated schools for other racial groups as well. So like there's a high school that was close to where I grew up. I didn't know until I was much older, and I was talking to my dad about some project I was doing for school, and he was telling me that when he moved here as a kid, that high school was segregated. And it's crazy to think like it was only that long ago, like in my dad's lifetime, that this was the case. Of course we still have the consequences today. I mean, of course, it was just a minute ago in the relative history of time. And, you know, it kind of blew my mind to think like that school was an only Latinx school. Like, I had no idea. This was a school I played like, you know, high school sports against or whatever. But it just goes to show that we don't examine the history of these things, so it means that we're often completely unaware of even the histories of our own towns and cities and when it comes to racial and ethnic inequality. Okay, looking at Arab Americans real quickly. Basically, this can be difficult to count the amount of Arab folks because of the way that racial categories exist on the U.S. Census. So technically, Arab Americans would mark white on the U.S. Census. So the actual number of Arab Americans is probably about twice as high as the government count, which is around 2 million people. Largely because, again, on the census, that they'd technically be white. And that's an interesting thing, too, about the social construction of racial categories, is that we see that different racial groups were considered white throughout time based on the social notions of that time. So that just shows how whiteness, how any of these categories, they're just socially, we just made them up, right? So Arab Americans are very diverse in terms of social class. Some are very highly educated professionals who work as physicians or, you know, engineers, professors, right? And others are working class folks who work in various skilled jobs in factories or construction or do service work, like work in hospitals, restaurants, or other settings. Okay, moving on to prejudice. So prejudice is any rigid or unfounded generalization about an entire category of people. So prejudice is a thought process, right? Versus discrimination is an action process. Stereotypes are an exaggerated description applied to every person in some category. Racial and ethnic stereotypes are a problem to the extent that they assume an entire category of people shares particular traits. So that's, again, interesting. Instead of someone admitting their hostility towards this one individual, they say, oh, no, that's how all those people are, right? Which is kind of a way for them to escape their own bigotry and blame for how that works. But also, it's just that our society has so many of these stereotypes, and we're socialized with them from the moment we're born, that even if you are in one of these stereotype communities, you might believe that stereotype against your own community. Because we're all being taught this all the time through our families, through the media, through our schools, through all of these different ways that we learn who has value and who doesn't. So racism is the assertion that people of one race are less worthy or even biologically inferior to others. And again, we'll talk about the history of that. It has everything to do with the history of eugenics and saying that people were biologically superior. So when we look at the social distance scale to measure prejudice, we see that, so the social distance scale itself is used to measure prejudice among U.S. Students that are at colleges and universities. And the results of this study that was repeated in 2011 showed a long-term trend that students are more accepting of all minorities, and that today's students see less difference between various minority populations. But the climate of concern over terrorism in the U.S. and the kind of forever wars has increased prejudice against Arabs and Muslims. So institutional racism is racism at work in the operation of social institutions, including the economy, schools, hospitals, the military, and the criminal justice system, among others. So racial profiling is where police or other people in power consider race or ethnicity to be by itself a sign of probable guilt. So this illustrates the operation of institutional racism. Because, again, the assumption outright is criminality. The assumption is blame. This kind of notion of you fit the description, or, I'm sure you've heard of this concept of driving while black, right? More people are killed because they have like a cell phone on them, and that's considered a gun, when these people are unarmed, yet these white mass shooters can walk into a place with an AR-15, kill dozens of people, and then be taken to Burger King on the way to jail, right? It's insane. It really does show the way that we value some lives more than others, so much so that we ignore the obvious reality in front of us. So prejudice is pretty strong in people with an authoritarian personality. Those people feel a lot of hostility and rigidly conform to conventional norms, see the world in stark contrast of right and wrong and us and them. And so it's easier for these people to blame others, to have hate and anger, than to connect, because to connect is to be vulnerable, right? To understand is to empathize. And a lot of people that have privilege and power, they don't want to empathize. They don't want to ever put themselves in someone else's shoes and understand from that perspective. They just want to blame. They just want to marginalize. They just want to feel like they're superior. So they kick whoever they can that's lower than them, right? There's also societal factors, though, that are causes of prejudice. So scapegoat theory says that prejudice develops among people who are frustrated at their lack of control over their lives. So if we talk about the white working class, right? Why is it that so many poor whites will vote against healthcare, will vote against raising the minimum wage, or will vote against all of these policies that would directly make their lives better financially? Because they don't want those people to have a better life. They don't want them, whatever this collective them is. And it could be whether it's recent immigrants, Latinx populations, African Americans, whoever it is that they blame for their own mediocrity in life, right? They're frustrated, they can't control their lives, and so it's like alluring to some people to blame that on someone else instead of, look a little bit at their own lives and really look at the structures of power and see how many of us get screwed through capitalism. And it's not blaming that immigrant. That immigrant didn't take your job. You're not a farm worker, right? What took your job was automation. What took your job was globalization. What took your job was capitalism. But we don't look at the real source of blame. We just point at each other and go, that's the problem. And so that's a huge issue that leads to, all sorts of horrible consequences. And so cultural theory then claims that prejudice gets built into our culture, right? Because prejudice, it has certain values about certain types of people. And that's going to affect the laws that are made. That's going to affect, policies, the way that policing happens. I mean, the fact that policing evolved from slave patrols is not surprising when you look at our current problems with policing, right? I mean, you just have to really understand the way these things are connected. So cultural theory is saying if there's prejudice in the culture, then that prejudice makes its way into all of our social institutions. And that's going to cause long-term institutional racism. So multiculturalism is a strategy for change, right? So multiculturalism includes educational programs designed to recognize cultural diversity in the U.S. and promote respect for other cultural traditions. So what we call assimilation from that point of view is really just everyone trying to be a WASP, right? A WASP is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? The fancy white folks. So Eurocentrism is part of this. Eurocentrism is a practice of using Europeans, particularly the English, as a cultural standard by which to judge everyone. To multiculturalists, U.S. culture itself is an expression of prejudice, because people in this country that differ from that dominant model are treated as less than. So although there's strong support for multiculturalism, especially among liberals in society, because it gives more visibility and power to minorities, there's a lot of people that claim that it's divisive, right? They'll say this about Black Lives Matter. Oh, it's very divisive. How is it divisive to say that Black Lives Matter? Like, that's just a fact. It shouldn't be divisive. That shouldn't trigger people. But it shows everything about what they think when they say that that's divisive, right? Okay, moving on to discrimination. So again, prejudice is the bias that people have and the stereotypes they believe, but discrimination involves actual treatment, so unequal treatment of various categories of people. So prejudice is your attitude, discrimination is your actions. So when it comes to institutional discrimination, this is discrimination built into the operation of social institutions, such as the economy, schools, the criminal justice system, etc. So prejudice and discrimination become a vicious cycle. Prejudice and discrimination reinforce each other. They maintain social inequality over time, right? Because the belief system, the prejudice, makes its way into, like the cultural model argues, makes its way into the culture, and then that produces policies that discriminate and actions by individuals that discriminate. So it's just a horrible circle. So there's different levels to this, right? There's also microaggressions. So these are casual actions, gestures, or words that demean people in some minority category. And these are the kind of things that people experience on a daily basis in constant, secession. Actually, there's this really interesting book called You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey. That's basically, there's this woman whom I love, Amber Ruffin. I'm like her number one fan because I'm a total nerd, and she's the best. And she has her own late night show now, which I couldn't be more excited about. And she wrote a book with her sister called You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey, about her sister still lives in the Midwest and deals with some of the most crazy racist stuff you've ever heard, right? If you're a white person, at least. So the book is really great. I've been listening to the audiobook because they read it together, and it's just so great. But it's such, obviously it's a hard read because it's all of these horrific stories about racism that she had to actually experience, but they are very telling. Like, you can see how they're grouped in patterns, you can see, and oftentimes the expectation is put on Lacey to educate these people as to why what they said was so racist, right? Like, one of the examples from the book was there was a particular place, I think it was a care home for the elderly that she was working at, and the kitchen staff complained because the air conditioner went out and it was no longer working, and it was crazy hot in the kitchen, and people were passing out and stuff. So she brought this complaint to the management, and the manager literally said, well, it's hot in Africa, referring to the idea that because most of the kitchen staff was black, somehow they biologically, inherently were stoked about it being hot. So then she had to spend 20 minutes of her life giving this guy a lesson about, first of all, pointing out that Africa's a continent. There's a lot of different temperatures. So that on its face is dumb. But also just the fact that people have these weird, messed up racist ideas in their pocket, ready to pull out to no, it's fine. It's fine that I treat someone unfairly because it's hot in Africa, or whatever it was. That one was one of the more, comical examples that Amber gives in the beginning to show how because Amber always laughs at her sister for this stuff, but it's written by a comedy writer, so there is a comedic effect to it. But these are horrific examples every day she has to go through all of this stupid stuff or work with these horrific people. Really, the thing that got me in that book was how many of the HR managers were incredibly racist. And these are the people who you're supposed to go to if someone at your job is racist. Shows how problematic that whole thing is. So microaggressions are not always micro, because you have to deal with them every day. And that guy said, oh, it's hot in Africa. That could be the microaggression. But then you have to go work with that idiot again the next day. That guy's still your boss. It's infuriating to think about, right? I really highly recommend the book. It's a great read. Anyway, let's move on to affirmative action. So affirmative action includes policies intended to improve the social standing of minorities that were subject to past prejudice and discrimination. So after World War II, the GI Bill sent a lot of minorities to college, right? And so legal challenges didn't start until the 70s, basically, because people were getting affirmative action in employment and college admissions through the 70s. And this meant a lot more people of color and a lot more women who were also under affirmative action had opportunities to go to college, to get better jobs, etc. So in 1978, legal challenges began considering gender and race in admissions. And in 1996 in California, that actually went through. We stopped doing affirmative action within college admission. Fun fact about that. The first year, right, when the data came in after affirmative action in 1996 was struck down in California, the population of African Americans that were going to college at the time was about 25% of the population of the school in California. And then when affirmative action policies stopped in 1996, that immediately went down the next year to 5%. So clearly there's still some racism and bias going on who gets admitted to college. And we can talk about this too. There's, a lot of research that looks at names, whether it's job applications, housing applications, things of this nature, where if you have a racialized name, sometimes this conveys a certain message to a white person in that position of authority as to whether they deny that person or approve that person. So an example I like to give, there's this video I use in my crim class of this guy who he couldn't get any jobs. He kept applying to jobs and couldn't get any responses. So he changed one letter in his name. He changed his name, the one letter of his name he removed. So he went from Jose to Joe. And then he sent those exact same resumes to the exact same places and actually got a bunch of responses. So the idea being that if someone reads the application, their mental perception of who Jose is different from who Joe is. Even though it's literally the same education, the same work experience, the same everything else, the name should not matter. But it does, right? So we know that there's still a lot of racism in these systems, or we wouldn't see a 20% drop in African American enrollment in 1 year once the affirmative action policies were gone. And again, let me just point this out. Affirmative action doesn't mean you get into college because you're black. It just means that they have to actually read your application. That's literally all it meant. Like, this whole quota thing is BS, all of that's BS. What's fascinating about it, though, is that it's how triggering it is to white people, right? Why? Why is it so triggering, the idea of affirmative action? Why is it so bad that people who were historically marginalized should get opportunities? Because the way they conceptualize it is, someone's getting something that they deserve, right? The assumption, the hegemony there being that somehow white folks, regardless of whether or not they have any talent or capability, especially white men in this context of affirmative action, because white women benefited from affirmative action. So for white men, why would it be threatening? Because now you have more competition on equal footing instead of being dominant because you're the dominant group in society. So it's interesting that people get mad triggered by affirmative action, but it worked. It alleviated a lot of inequality and it gave a lot more opportunities to women and people of color until, these things were struck down. They basically have reified the idea that somehow it's harmful to the dominant group that has all the power, which is insane because they already have all the power. They can already go to college, right? But the idea is no, all of the resources of society are supposed to be hierarchical and go to the people with the most power. So let's look at some different theories and how they interpret racial and ethnic inequality. So structural functional analysis looks at the importance of culture. So some of the functional arguments come from this culture of poverty argument, right? Which we talked about a little bit before. This idea of growing up poor and learning to accept that reality, that young people will then have lower self-esteem, limited aspirations, and a sense of powerlessness, right? Like if you're trapped in endemic poverty, you don't feel like you're going to get out, that's obviously going to affect your trajectory. Like if you're just like almost homeless, living paycheck to paycheck, you're worried about getting food, you're worried about having shelter, you're not worried about what degree am I going to get, what job do I want to get, right? You're just trying to survive. So, that means that as adults, you're not going to take necessarily advantage of the same opportunities as you would have if you didn't have those disadvantages, because you've been so internally focused on just trying to make it, right? So also this is going to give a different sense of entitlement as middle class folks have so much about their lives is like they're the center of the universe, right? Like they treat their parents like crap. They like yell for them to get them snacks. Their parents cart them from soccer to, their clarinet lesson or whatever it is back and forth, and basically let these kids make decisions in their own lives, which gives them the sense of entitlement when they reach, especially higher education. They feel more like they're going to go to office hours, they're going to ask questions, they're going to push back, where for a lot of poor kids that didn't have that kind of upbringing, they're taught like, well, if the teacher said that's your grade, that's your grade. You don't argue it, right? Or, if things are in certain contexts, like your boss, treats you in a certain way, they treat you in that way. And so part of this is a working class issue, and part of this is being a racial or ethnic minority. Kind of overlaps. I said symbolic when I meant structural. Oof. You saw it. You saw it on the screen. You're fine. So symbolic interaction is looking at the personal meaning of race. So symbolic interaction is always saying we create meanings when we interact with each other. And so, the book looks at Du Bois and how he talked about that from an African-American perspective, race creates this double consciousness, a sense of always looking at yourself through the eyes of others. So you have your own consciousness, right, your own experience, but then you have the consciousness of the dominant society that says that you're not something or you're less than something. And so living as a racial or ethnic minority in American society means kind of having that experience of double consciousness. From a conflict analysis, they look at the structure of inequality and really kind of look at the intersection between race, ethnicity, and social class. So Marx and Engels pointed to racial and ethnic diversity of the United States as one of the main reasons that U.S. workers won't come together to form a socialist movement. And there's a history to that too. I mean, labor unions around the turn of the century, when labor was the most powerful group in American society, they were extremely racially segregated, right? So they made labor unions where especially black laborers were not allowed to join. And so that's incredibly dumb from a labor perspective, because the whole point of labor unions is you organize masses of people to push back against the owners of these corporations or these businesses or these industries. And by segregating themselves by gender, by race and ethnicity, they lost that kind of cohesive power that could have made for a much stronger worker right movement. We have like the weakest workers' rights movement in the world, kind of, when it comes to developed countries. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later and why that is. But it does lead to a lot of the conditions that we have now in work in our society. Okay, so looking at constructing problems and defining solutions. So conservatives in the far right look at culture. They say that effort matters. According to the conservative view, social standing should reflect people's level of ambition. So if they place importance on schooling and they have commitment to hard work, they should succeed. Yeah, they should. I agree. But that's like a weird fairy tale about how this world actually works, right? In a society like ours, people are free, but they're also unequal. So conservatives claim that any society in which government tries to engineer rigid social equality would almost certainly offer very little personal freedom. So, you may want to discuss the views of the alt-right, which supports white supremacy and explicitly defends Anglo culture and the increasing importance of basically, it's like just even talking about, or even giving them the legitimacy of calling them alt-right instead of calling them Nazis or white supremacists, makes it sound like they're just thinkers and not people who literally are advocating for the extermination of other folks. People who want to legally restrict the rights of entire groups of people, right? That's what's going on when you talk about quote-unquote alt-right, right? The radical right. So they want laws that say only people can immigrate here are from white countries. They want laws that structure the value of whiteness to be above every other racial category. That's scary, right? That's reality. And obviously, through the Trump years, we saw that rock get lifted up and all of these little tiki torches run out from under that rock. And it kind of exposed a lot of people, especially here in the West, where they might have had more ethnic and racial diversity and less like obvious KKK members. I had a lot of students that were like shocked by the level of racism at that time. And I remember being like saddened and just saying, well, this That's always been there. It's just that people feel emboldened now. There was a lot of years of people somehow think it's like more offensive to be called a racist than to be a racist. It's very bizarre, right? And so this really affects the kind of, how can we talk about solutions when we don't even have an agreed upon definition of the problems, right? So liberals look at how society and government matters. Liberals acknowledge that there may be cultural differences between various categories of the population, but they see the differences more as the result of social inequality and less as the result of like an inherent inferiority, right? So that is, people that are shut out of opportunities, whether they're rural or inner city residents, can develop a sense of hopelessness about their situation because you're trapped. Like, being broke sucks. And it's perpetuated in this way of like, it does feel like a trap, and it feels like no one gives a crap about you. So that can be incredibly unmotivational, right? So, minorities themselves are not the problem. From a liberal perspective, the responsibility for the situation is the structure of power and privilege in the society. And of course, the radical left goes much further with this, right? Radicals point out that fundamental changes are needed. So they say as long as a capitalistic society defines workers as a supply of labor, there's little reason to expect an end to exploitation and oppression, which are based on both class and race ethnicity. So the radical left makes the argument that the only way to reduce racial and ethnic inequality is to attack the source of all inequality, which is capitalism itself. So going on from here, minorities still suffer the consequences of prejudice and discrimination, and these harmful biases exist not only in the attitudes and actions of individuals, but very importantly, in the operation of society itself. So for this reason, the inequality described in this chapter is carried from generation to generation, right? So the social class status and race ethnicity of your parents is often going to dictate your opportunities and basically where you're going to end up in life. So this is a huge problem that we have to really discuss. How do we alleviate this as a social problem? How do we make a more equitable future where people are basically in a meritocracy? Like we talked about meritocracy before when we were talking about social class. Wouldn't it be great if how hard you worked reflected in how much money you made or your standard of living? Because the way I always say that is, if you got paid based on how hard you work, then roofers would make so much money, right? Because I don't know about you, but when it's like, 90 plus degrees outside in California, like all the damn time, do you want to go up on someone's roof in a perilous job where you could fall and hurt yourself terribly, and then breathe in hot tar all day in the baking sun, right? Working bent over, fixing people's roofs, which is, an important service. Why aren't they making billions of dollars, right? If we're talking about who works the hardest, you're going to tell me some CEO sitting in an office moving money around in a bank account is working harder than a guy on a roof? I don't believe you, right? So we have to really look at, how can we create a system where people are rewarded for their efforts, but also a system where people have opportunities. So if they want to move into, kind of a better situation for their families, for the future generations that come after them, that they have those opportunities and that they're not restricted based on their race or ethnicity.